How you all doing? Thanks very much for coming to the first of our two lectures as part of this year's Páirc O'Keeffe Festival. If you're down the back there, don't be afraid to come up, you'll hear things and see things a lot better. You're too small. Anyway. And it's a great honour for us to have Niamh Charra here today. I grew up with Niamh in Killarney. She's a big picture of Dad there. Owns a big part of all our lives in Killarney. And great man for getting kids to play music and kept the mind us all. And Niamh sent me on actually some pictures of us playing music and we were about 10, 11 years of age there. And yeah, it was, none of us recognised each other at all. But when she was a child during the 1980s, she built up a relationship with Cos Teehan, and he had quite a lot of time for Niamh, and he went to the bother of sending her tunes, sending her voice recordings on tape, and she learned an awful lot about Cos, and so I had the idea that it would be great for her to tell us a little bit more about the band. We see so much of him, and his names, put the tunes, etc. And it'd be great to get the full picture. So big welcome for Niamh Charra.
Thanks, Paddy, and thanks a million for the invitation here. This is a festival I have been hearing about for years, and I was always on the road gigging myself. So finally getting a chance to spend a bit of time in Castleisland, and long overdue. So delighted to be here. I'm going to talk about, as Paddy said, about Cos Teehan, and I suppose before I start talking about him, I wanted to talk about the kind of sources that I'll be using and that I have used in the past, and the very personal link that I had to Paddy, to Cos that Paddy mentioned there earlier. I suppose the first thing about Cos Teehan is that it's a name that we all know really, really well in the Sliabh tradition, but there's very little actual published material from Cos, or directly from Cos. There's lots of recordings, of course, of people playing his tunes, but direct sources, not so much. So the first two sources that I found hugely useful when I was doing research on an album that I'll talk about in a little minute are two tune books, essentially self-published. The first one is this one here, that I have my own copy to, and there's another copy in the Irish Traditional Music Archive. We'll be plugging them all day today as well. The Road to Glanton. This is one where he essentially dictated a huge amount of kind of background information on himself and his life growing up, and the background to the tunes that he composed. And the whole book is his own compositions, except for a few exceptions at the very end of the book that are compositions in his honour. That was a huge source of information. There was another book, that one was published in 1980, and then another one was published in 1988, and that one was called Sliabh on Parade, and that was a mix. Again, he kind of dictated his notes to a different guy this time, Paul Delacre, and it's a mixture of more of his compositions, but also the repertoire that he had built up while in Castleisland area, while in Glanton, and before he moved to Chicago. So there are the two kind of published books as such. Recordings, again, very, very thin on the ground. The only commercial recording of Cos Teehan was one that was done by Mick Maloney, and it was one that featured himself and another musician, ironically not playing together. It's a set of tunes from Terry and then a set of tunes from Gene Kelly, and recorded at two different occasions altogether. That one is called Old Time Irish Music in America, and that was done in 1978. And I will talk a little bit about Mick Maloney further on as well, and how that all came about. There was another recording done that was essentially kind of a compilation of all of the musicians that were living in Chicago at the time, that were part of the Irish music scene. And it went from the young guns of the time, which were Liz Carroll and Jimmy Keane, up to the elders. And so there's two tracks on that album from Cos. And apart from that, there was nothing else out there at all. And if it hadn't been for a chance encounter between Mick Maloney and Cuz, we wouldn't even have that much, to be honest. And then the third source is what I'm going to use today. It's a tribute album that I did in Cuz's honour, but it features clips from a tape I'm going to talk about in a minute. And it features a lot of guest musicians that all had links to Cuz in some form or other from both sides of the water. So there are the commercial recordings. There's also private interviews. There's an interview that he did with Mick Maloney. Again, I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. That was a private interview that Mick set up. That was in 1976. There's a personal tape that Cuz made for me, and that was in 1986, 10 years later. Cuz regularly recorded tunes into tapes and gave them to musicians that were passing through Chicago. And when I went to see if any of these tapes were out there and accessible, I couldn't find any. So the only one I think so far that's in the Irish Traditional Music Archive is the one that Cuz made for me that I donated afterwards, or donated a copy of. So that was a huge source of information as well. And then the very last thing is peers. So the musicians I grew up with, Cuz, on the Irish side, Nicky McAuliffe, who has been my teacher and who continues to be my teacher as far as I'm concerned all my life. Himself and Anne were people that Cuz would regularly visit when he was home. Donna Murphy, Begley's. Over in Chicago, you had Liz and Jimmy that I mentioned earlier, and of course Mick Maloney, who was still alive at the time when I was doing this research. So I just wanted to explain the tape itself and how that came about, and give you a little bit of an excerpt of it. In 1986, Cuz visited Ireland for what I think was his last visit, and he ended up staying with his niece, Bride Sullivan, who was from the far side of Killarney. Bride never knew what to do with Cuz when he was visiting. He was like the returned Yank, and she didn't know how to keep him entertained. And of course, Killarney being Killarney and a tourist town, there was always concerts going on. So one day she brought him to a concert that I was playing in, and I was very young at the time. And he took a bit of a shine to me. And he took a shine to me, I think, for a few reasons. One, I was probably, at the time, one of the youngest on the stage. But I was also playing concertina and fiddle, which was a very unusual combination when I was growing up, but quite a common one when Cuz was growing up. That shows the different kind of phases of popular instruments. And when I was growing up, I was surrounded by accordions. But when Cuz was growing up, and I'll talk about it in a little moment, he was surrounded by musicians, but they were mainly playing fiddles, flutes, and concertinas. So he was delighted to see the concertina kind of coming back, I suppose. And he went back to Chicago and he sat down in his kitchen and he made a tape for me. And what's brilliant about the tape, which I still have, and it's a brilliant gift in terms of passing on the tradition and passing on the music, that he talked to me as if I was sitting opposite him at the kitchen table. And I'm going to play a little excerpt of the tape now, so you get an idea of exactly that. And this is a track where he's talking about a tune where he discovered the second part was not the original second part. So instead he decides to compose a different second part altogether. So it's still not the original tune, but he gives this the name Maggie Scholars.
This is Maggie Scholars. The turning is my own, because I found out from hearing it in written music that the turning was another tune. So the first part is correct and the second part is my own.
example of the type of tracks that are on the tape that he made me, which was about an hour long. So a really, really special gift. And you can see the tape here on the right, a photograph of it. So what's up here is a tribute album that I did for Cuz in 2013, 11 years ago now, which is a bit of a shock. And this was something that I had been planning to do for a while, but I kind of wanted to get up and running myself and get a bit of experience. But a huge part of it was that I felt, having listened to Cuz's tape, that there was a lot of credit that he was due that he hadn't got so far. He was hugely, hugely significant in our tradition, and he hadn't really been acknowledged in terms of the amount of compositions that he had done, and his influence as well on the Irish music scene in Chicago. So this was a tribute album that I did, and it features quite a lot of those people that had a connection to Cuz. So Cuz's early life, and a lot of this was research I did for the album back a decade ago. He was born, as many of you here will probably know, not very far from here at all, in Cordoba, in Glanton, in Castle Island, in 1905. His dad died when he was very young. There's very little information on his dad, other than that he was a farmer, but also that he played the flute and the fiddle, but Cuz himself didn't realise this until quite late in his own life. However, he was still surrounded by music after his dad passed. His mother, Julia, or Jude to her friends, was a great singer, and a lot of people used to visit the house to hear her singing, and they would bring instruments, so music was coming into the house. But also both Julia's sisters and Cuz's dad's sisters all played, so he was surrounded by brilliant musicians, lots of women, which is a theme that I've picked up the whole way through this. His mom sang kind of lots of old-timey songs, but Cuz also talks about Johini songs that she would sing, but with entirely different lyrics. So it seems to be quite a mix. It was all English language. The only Irish language in the house was Cuz's dad's mother, who only spoke Irish. The other, I suppose, massive influence, and we are at the Patrick O'Keeffe Festival, so it's very suitable, is the fact that Cuz was taught by 3 O'Keeffes. First of all, in the school, the Glanton school, he was taught for 3 years by Sean, that's Patrick's dad, and then he was taught by Patrick or Padraig for a few years, and then Padraig's sister Nora, and he describes in the book here, The Road to Glanton, he describes how a typical school day would feature during the summer, kind of army drills up and down the road. So he says, the O'Keeffes lived right across the road from the school. You'd have 45 minutes for lunch, and in the summertime they would come with 2 fiddles, and they would march us maybe 1.5 miles up the road and back. They were like army drills. So you can imagine them up and down the road, and you'd be wondering as well what shape Padraig was in when he was doing these drills with the kids, because sometimes he was a little delicate, shall we say. Another big part of Cuz's upbringing was the fact that, as I mentioned before, he was surrounded by musicians, and not just his aunts on both sides. He could list 34 musicians in a 2.5 mile radius, what he called a section. And actually, many of these musicians are named in his own compositions. He goes into a lot of detail, and it's really, I suppose, a really interesting source of social history. He goes into a lot of detail on his upbringing, but the real, I suppose, common theme throughout is how much he was let to kind of roam freely. He was more or less left to his own devices a lot of the time, and he really had a wonderful childhood. Significantly, he stopped playing music twice. The first time when he was 10, there was a gang of them coming back from a rambling house or somewhere they had been playing. And they were crossing a bridge, a very makeshift bridge, and there was a friend of his, a girl who was holding the concertina, and there had been a storm, so the river was quite high, and the concertina ends up in the river. And apparently it wasn't the drenching that the concertina got that did the damage. It was the fact that they then tried to dry it out by the fireplace, and of course everything fell apart and melted off, because these wouldn't have been they were to be cheap instruments, so there wasn't much to them. So that was the first time he stopped playing. And then there's talk in the book about there being a kind of a collection where a few of them would chip in to buy a concertina, and it became almost like the village concertina. And he talks as well about visiting Katie Scollard frequently and playing her concertina. So he would go to various houses to play the instruments that were in the house. But the second significant time that he stopped playing, and this one was for quite a long time, it was in 1921, a day before the Civil War ended, and 3 local young men died in what was known as the Castle Island ambush. Cos composed what he says was his very first composition, and then he didn't play for 7 years, and then he emigrated. And then even on the other side, it took a long time before he started playing again. Well, this is the composition here, and you can see the names of the 3 young men forever kind of memorialised in this tune. And it was something that Cos felt very strongly about. You know, he constantly memorialises people in his tunes. So he emigrates to Chicago in 1928 when he's about 23. And he starts off, first of all, working in Sears and Western Electric until 1931. And of course, we're talking about the Depression years in America. He ends up going back to Ireland for about 2 years before he returns again in 1933. And for about 3 years, he's not doing much at all. He's scraping a living. He's not getting any full-time work. And it's not until 1936 that he gets a full-time job with Illinois Central Railway, and he works with them until he retires in 1970. This is at the stage where he gets his nickname, Cos. He's working for Illinois Central, and there is a stream of people from this area emigrating to America, and they're all being given Cos's number if they're aiming for Chicago. And he gets a call, and he organises an interview, and then he tells them, just tell them you're a cousin of mine. And that's how he got the nickname Cos. And what's really lovely and really sweet about this nickname is that he was really proud to have a nickname. He was dead chuffed that he had a nickname. But also, he starts to use it almost like a verbal tick, the way we would use the word like as a kind of a stopgap when we're talking. He used the word Cos, his own nickname, as his verbal tick. And I've never heard anyone else doing it. It was something he created for himself. Almost like a stylized thing, I suppose. I've said that he had kind of stopped playing. It wasn't until about 1940, a neighbour, Mr. Teehan, I think is how you pronounce the surname, although I could be wrong. He loans him a very battered accordion, and he starts playing again. And around the same time, another neighbour finds out that he used to play, and he secretly enters him into a competition. Now, this competition is called Amateur Hour, and it's run by the Mars Sax Hour radio program. And what would happen is people would they would have to send in a list of tunes that they planned to play. The radio station would then clear them, make sure that there was no copyright issues, choose one for them to play. They would play that, and then the general public would mail in votes for who they wanted to win. So first of all, because of the selection process, we know that Cos played Miss McLeod's. And we also know that he came either first or second, he can't remember which, but it was because the Irish community were encouraged to mail in votes for him. What he does remember is that he got $75 and a watch. But this is kind of the start of him getting back into playing, and he ends up playing regularly in large music halls, 3 nights a week. From about 1943 to 1964, he's playing 3 nights a week, and it's getting busier and busier, and he's pumping out the music. And it gets to the stage where the people running the events decide to kind of thin out the band and put them in a few halls at once to make more money. And he ends up playing for 1,500 people on his own, and he says, I've had enough of this, fill in the blank. So he stops for a while, but he's still playing in terms of the local community. He's playing weddings, he's playing benefits, any event that's going. He's very much involved in the local community, to the extent that in 1978 he is named Irish Man of the Year at the Harp and Shamrock. So he was a huge part of the Irish scene and the Irish American scene for what was essentially 3/4 of his life. He emigrated when he was 23 and he died when he was 84. 3/4 of that was in Chicago. So a very significant part of his life was this one-off incident and its meeting with Mick Maloney. So Mick was passing through with a group and he had organised to meet another musician in a pub that he wanted to interview. And he arrived at the pub and there was a session going and it was going full throttle. And then in walks Cuz, and Mick describes it as the energy level just went up several notches, and the excitement and I suppose the roguery level as well, the mischief-making level rose a few slots. And Mick was really taken with Cuz, so he organised that he interviewed Cuz as well the next day. And it's out of this recording that we get the interview that Mick donated to the Smithsonian. It's out of that recording that we get the commercial recording with Gene Kelly and that whole connection that was made between Mick and Cuz. But also, Mick does something else. He is very taken with an unusual hobby that Cuz had, and that was embroidery. And actually, during the years when he had very little work, he made his living selling what were quite kind of kitschy pieces of embroidery. And there's actually a copy of one of them on the cover of his Road to Glantown book. And he used to give them a lot as gifts. So Mick Maloney organised that a selection of these pieces of embroidery would be donated to the Smithsonian, and they actually went on display. So because of Mick Maloney, we have Teehan featuring in the folklore section of the Smithsonian. Cuz himself talks about the significance of this meeting. He says, I have been around for many, many years with many tapes and many written tunes and all this, and I was never recognised until Mick Maloney. So wherever I go from here, it was actually him that started me off. And he's saying that when he's 71 years old. So he's envisaging a fantastic career beginning at the age of 71. And in this photograph, which is also from that book, he's actually showing Mick a whole selection of his embroidery. So he was very proud of the embroidery. I'm not an accordion player, and I'm seeing quite a few accordion players here, so this particular side, bear with me. I don't know much about various makes of accordions, but what I would like to show you is the type of accordion that Cuz used to play for the dance halls. Bling would be an understatement. You could see just about, you could probably see Teehan down the side. That would have been very blingy. Any concertina or any accordion that he had got a nickname. He had Big Liz was one of his accordions, and it was a 1-row 8-reed Baldoni Bartoli. He had another accordion called Blackie. And in this picture we see him playing with Mr. Tim Teehan, so that's spelled Guihwem. I'm not really sure how you pronounce that. I suspect it's the same guy, or at least a relation of the neighbour that got him started in 1940. So again, nicely significant. So that's his upbringing and his move to Chicago and all of the performing that he does, but a huge reason that we know about him is because of his compositions. Those that never met him, those that never heard him playing directly, so many of us in this tradition have come across his name because of the tunes. So he's very much established within our tradition. He was also quite a prolific composer. He composed over 80 compositions, many of them in these 2 books that were produced. He was also associated with playing other Sliabh tunes, and sometimes things would get a little bit confused. Tunes would be credited to him that weren't his, and tunes that were his were never accredited to him. And I'll come to that a little bit later. One of the lovely things about all of his tune titles, and I kind of mentioned it earlier, is the social history that's evident in the titles and in the background information that he gave when he was composing these tunes that he gives in the books. You've got place names, you've got events, you've got people, you've got activities, all included, and I'm going to go into a few of those now over the coming slides. But not only did he compose himself, he was hugely encouraging of other musicians, getting them to compose. And the most obvious one, I think, in my book, she's one of my idols as a fiddle player, is Liz Carroll. Both Liz Carroll and Jimmy Keane were contemporaries. They played a lot together in Chicago, and Cus Teehan actively encouraged them to compose. And of course, Liz Carroll is one of the most prolific composers that we have now of the Irish tradition. He also often would compose tunes for others that he himself couldn't play, and he had no qualms or hang-ups about that. He would openly admit this. He talks about tunes he composed for Liz Carroll that he hadn't hope of playing himself. And part of this was he felt it wasn't suitable on the instrument, but sometimes he felt, well, I wouldn't be able for it, but Liz would. So, you know, there's a huge lack of ego there, I think, which is lovely. One of the fun challenges I had when I was researching, and I think it's a challenge that everybody has these days now, is the difficulties establishing tune titles and in some cases the actual composers. And it was a continuous source of frustration for Cuz as well. Like he was exasperated a few times on the tape, or it would come across kind of as ironic or amusement that so many of his own compositions weren't credited to him. While tunes that he insisted he never had any hand in writing were being attributed to him. So I talked about social history. We've events, for example, the Castle Island ambush that I talked earlier, that's mentioned. We have places, Glantown School. You have the Castle Island Horse Fair that was mentioned in one of his tunes, and in fact his mother bought him his first concertina at that fair. You also have a kind of a way of life being preserved, and I think this is an interesting thing that sometimes gets forgotten in the social history that we're looking at every day when we look at Irish tunes and Irish tune names. I'm going to play you a track from the tribute album that I did, but it includes a snip from the tape that Cuz made. And it's of, not one of his own compositions, it's of a tune well known to all of us, The Lonesome Road to Dingle. And of course, this is a tune where there isn't a song to it. There's a verse that's kind of used as a mnemonic, a way of remembering a song, but it refers to the train line between Dingle and Tralee, and of course that's gone now, so a way of life that's gone. I also wanted to show this so that you could see, when I was doing my tribute album, I wanted to make sure that I never played alongside Cuz at the same time. I didn't think it was right. So you hear Cuz separately, and then you hear the musicians playing on the album, playing the same tune maybe, or related to it. So you hear one after the other. And I suppose it's a bit like when you take an old building and you build on an extension that you're very deliberately making the modern bit. You're delineating them in as clear a manner as you possibly can. This is The Lonesome Road to Dingle. It's followed by two compositions of Cuz's. The first is Dave Kennedy's Gift, the second is Cuz Teehan's Favourite, and then one of my own called The Nun's Cuttings. And again, I suppose that was me sneaking in a little bit of the background to Cuz. He had huge green fingers, he was massively interested in gardening, and he was always swiping bits of plant cuttings and taking them with him, including the nuns. He felt they had loads and they had a lovely garden, and he would take a few cuttings and then he would bring them back to America. So he was breaking loads of rules in terms of smuggling plants internationally and all of that. So this was a tune that I wrote in his honour. It's called The Nuns Cuttings, so that's at the very end. And you hear Cuz at the very start.
Are you the man that drive the train from Monaskal to Castlemaine before the rail get into blame the lonesome road to Dingle?
So the guests on that track were Donal Murphy and Tommy Sullivan, in case anyone was wondering. And of course, Cuz would have met them regularly, passing through Donal in particular. So another element to social history is the mention of clothes. And I'm bringing that up because there was a gorgeous barn dance on the tape that Cuz made me. Not one of his own, but a barn dance that he very deliberately put on the tape because he was afraid it was going to get forgotten. It was a barn dance that was very popular when he was in Kerry, and when he emigrated to Chicago, every time he was coming home he was noticing it was falling more and more out of the repertoire until it was completely gone. And it was a barn dance called the Dolly Varden, which you're going to hear in a minute. It's a lovely, lovely barn dance. But it's also, I was trying to work out what the hell is a Dolly Varden. Well, the answer is that Dolly Varden was a character in Charles Dickens' novel, Barnaby Rudge. It's a type of trout, and it is a type of lady's skirt in the 19th century which became a fashion fad and inspired many popular songs, including one with the lyrics, "She dresses in bed furniture just like a flower garden, a blowing and a growing, and they call it the Dolly Varden." Not very flattering of the style, definitely. The second tune on this track is another tune that he played in the album that, again, very much part of the repertoire, not one of his own. That's one you'll all recognise as Monroe. But what I found very funny was, again, he doesn't just play it, he sings it. And it's this idea of the 4-line verse being used as a way of reminding people of the tune, because so many people were musically illiterate. They could read and write, but they couldn't write down music. And of course, the more outlandish the lyrics, the more likely you were to remember the tune. And so this wasn't necessarily PG. And if you think at the time I was quite young getting this tape, it was something I always found funny. And I therefore deliberately included it in the album, but at the end of a track, so that those playing the track on the radio, if they hadn't done their homework, they were caught by surprise. So here we are.
fourpenny nail in the saddle, went up to the quickener hours.
You can see why I couldn't not put that on the album. And still to this day there are people who have the album and they come up to me and go, that's my son's favourite track. Another aspect of all of this, I mentioned it earlier, I cheekily called this Cuz's Women, but he was surrounded by fantastic female musicians, and he lists them, he names them in his own tune compositions, and without that we wouldn't know of their existence because so many of them never recorded. And I give a talk regularly on 100 years of women in Irish traditional music, and one of the things I touch on is the fact that so many existed that we don't have an official record for. But thanks to Cuz, we have a long list of female musicians from this area. In some cases, these had stopped playing, and there's one I want to mention and read out what Cuz said about her, because you can hear the kind of the surprise and almost horror and disappointment that this had happened. He's talking about Katie Scollard, who was the neighbour from 2 doors up, the person that he learned so many of his tunes from. She was without a doubt as fine a concertina player as ever lived. She had a completely different style, and when Cuz used the term different, he meant exceptional. That was the way he used that word. Smooth. I learned many of my tunes from her when going for water from Scollard's Well. I went to see her with my tape recorder in 1976 and I was amazed. She didn't play at all. She'd given it up 30 years back and had not played a note. She could not even remember the tunes, as she were lost to Irish music. So we have Katie memorialised in the slide that Cuz calls after her, but she herself had stopped playing. And again, in the research I was doing for this other talk, it was quite a common thing that women would just stop playing. They got married, they felt, if they married a musician, they felt one musician in the house was enough. There's lots of different reasons why they stopped, but a lot of them did. People like concertina player Kitty Hayes, she stopped when she married and she didn't start playing again until her husband had passed away. And we don't know why. We don't know if it was because he asked her to or not, because it was her son that actually persuaded her to get back playing again. So these gaps are quite significant. But because of Cuz, we have quite a few names to list out. And in the photograph here you have Una McGlue. These 3 women are women that Cuz played regularly with in Chicago. Una McGlue, Maida Shukru from Ballymcgilligan, and Mary McDonough. So that's 3 of the women. Names listed: Eleanor Neary, Liz Carroll, Mary McKay, Leah Curtin, Anne Heyman, Maida Shukru, Mary Mayer, Mary McDonough, Barbara Dahill, Courtney Quinn, Jonas Sullivan, Katie Scollard, Una McGlue, Maggie Scollard, Mary Shea and Minnie Looney. So quite a lot of names just there, and really, really important that they're named. Another name we don't have a surname for, and it wasn't because she's not a musician either, but she does get referenced. Her name was Biddy, and there's a lovely waltz that he composed for Biddy and Thaig. It's called Thaig and Biddies, and these were both single individuals that lived to their 90s, and they both ran rambling houses, and Cuz had huge respect for them, so he wanted them again memorialised. I've mentioned Liz Carroll a few times, so I'm going to play a track where Liz is guesting. And it starts off with Thaig and Biddies, and then Dennis Murphy's slide number 2, which I'll talk about very briefly in a minute. Another one of Cuz's compositions, Mary Shea's Promise to Her Dog. Now there's actually a full title to that, but I couldn't print it, because it's Mary Shea's Promise to Her Dog, My Toe Up Your Hole. This is Cuz Teehan in a nutshell. And then another slide at the end, not one of Cuz's, but one I had never heard before until I got the tape, and I think it's a fab slide. It's called Dust on the Bible. So this is Liz Carroll and Jimmy Keane on piano accordion, with Donna Hennessy on guitar. was two Chicago musicians terrified of playing a slide, and I think they did a fine job. I talked earlier about the difficulties in naming tunes, and this is an image of from the session .org.com, I can never remember .org, and it's the Galway Bell. This is a tune often known as Cos Teehan's. In fact, it's up here as Cos's and Terry Teehan's. This is an example of a tune he didn't write. He was very adamant that he didn't write it. Another tune, the Ballyhoura Mountains, also known often as Cos Teehan's Delight or Cos Teehan's Favourite, and he didn't write that either. But he himself was as bad. He would take a tune and give it an entirely different name if he couldn't remember the name himself. And two examples of that are, there's a tune, Johnny, I Do Miss You. He called that the Bit of Shit. And the reason he called it that was because he was playing the tune at some event, and there was a very underwhelmed young lad who didn't seem to have much mass in Irish music and had quite a few drinks taken, and he ambled over to them and said, what's that bit of shit you're playing? So he called it the Bit of Shit. And then there's another one, Dennis Murphy's number 2 that you heard in the last track. He called that the paper plate because he didn't know have a name for it. And he named it the paper plate in honour of his very first meeting with Liz Carroll. And Liz was asking him for his address. And so he was writing the address out on the first thing to hand, which was a paper plate, and he was humming the slide at the same time. So it became known as the paper plate, and actually it got recorded as the paper plate by Liz and by others. So you can see how misnaming something then gets perpetuated, and we get into deeper quagmire in terms of trying to track down tunes. I think one of the tunes that showed just how difficult it was in working out what Cos had written and what Cos hadn't written is one called Minnie Looney's Slide, which I'm going to let you hear now in a minute. And just I see Liam and Bodie down there. I'd say 5 minutes. You can. I know you have gigs after your bit, so don't worry. We started a bit late. Cos, towards the end of his life, had been playing Minnie Looney's Slide so long that he was no longer sure whether it was one of his or not. It appeared in the Sliabh and Parade, the second of the books of tunes, the one that Paul de Lochry published for him. And it was written there as Minnie Looney's and marked as one of Cos's compositions. But when Cos got a copy of the book, he then circled it and said, not sure, I don't really know. So he was kind of contradicting himself. To confuse matters further, it was also recorded by Cos on the album Old Time Irish Music in America, the one that he did with Mick Maloney way back that I talked about first. And on that, he calls it The Evening I Spent with Mick. Not to be confused with The Day I Spent with Mick, which was another composition of Cos's. On the sleeve notes of that album, he said he learned the tune from the old guys but had no name for it. So that's actually probably the most likely thing that happened. But he played it for so long that he ended up not just giving it one name, he gave it 2 names, and neither of them the right name. So just a complete confusion all around. Another example, in a very different kind of a way, is a tune that he did write, Mickey Chewing Bubblegum. It's a tune we all know, but what happened was he composed the tune. Now, allegedly, this is Cos's story. He composed the tune early on and then promptly emigrated. And it was a tune that Padraig O'Keeffe really liked and started teaching to all of the local pupils. But it hadn't been named yet. And then got associated with one of the people that played it, which was Bill Sullivan. So it's a tune that's now known as Bill Sullivan's. But Cos subsequently did give it a name, and he called it Mikey Chewing Bubblegum after his nephew, and in Cos's own words, who was always chewing the bloody gum. So that's the dum 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 dum. That is Cos says it's his, and it's called Mikey Chewing Bubblegum. So here is a set of tunes for you now, and you'll hear Minnie Looney's that I mentioned there at the very end. And another guest, very important guest, and we miss him. We lost him there last year, and this is Seamus Begley, along with Donna. And what I love about this track is that Seamus and Cuz were definitely made out of the same cloth, because you hear mischief throughout this.
I stuck my head in a big fuzz bush and shouted, oh my, oh, will I ever get rid of the wife I have with the corn on her toe?
Sound familiar? Probably the fastest lines I've ever played in my life, but we just ran with it. That particular day we were recording, Seamus arrived down from digging up in the field, and the studio it was done as a studio. There was soil and air and everything flying everywhere, but a very enjoyable day. So we've heard of Cuz the musician, Cuz the composer, but did you know that Cuz was a poet? He was constantly writing poems, and I'm going to read two out for you now, very, very briefly, before we finish up. You can breathe a sigh of relief there at the back of you. So the first one is one that I think is gorgeous, because it really, it's a nod to his youth and him remembering his mum singing. Oh, to be in Kerry, it would be my heart's delight to hear the fiddlers playing and the turf fires burning bright, to hear my mother singing as I did in days of yore, and hear polkas, jigs and reels battered out upon the floor, to hear the gang applauding as she sang those grand old songs, and if I did not listen, I got walloped with the tongs. Around the house and mind the dresser, I can hear my brother say, as my sister filled the kettle with the water for the tea. Those days I can't recapture, no matter how I try, and many nights I tried to sleep when tears bedim my eye. I can hear the crickets singing and the raindrops on the pane, but my mother's voice still drowns them out, and with me still remains. So that he was always thinking of home. The second poem is a very different kind of poem. This is a poem called Cuz's Funeral Arrangements, which he wrote 2 years before he died, planning ahead. Of all the undertakers, Tom Ahern, you are the best. When I finally pass away, you can lay me down to rest. Calvary is my burying place, adjacent to the lake. Be sure and plant me deep enough, so a walk I cannot take. My funeral arrangements already have been made. There'll be no going back to restaurants and no flowers, they'll only fade. Instead I want the Bunch of Keys, played by Jimmy Keane, with Marty, Liz and Michael bringing up the refrain. And if they play it good enough, I might decide to shout, if you are there, you narrowbacks, why don't you let me out? Narrowback was a slang term for an Irish American. So there you have it. I just wanted to finish, I suppose, with this little thought. Cos was an immense influence on so many people, and not just as a musician, but as a composer. I mentioned earlier he encouraged people like Liz and Jimmy Keane to compose, but he was also somebody that directly influenced me and made me kind of take up the challenge. And I don't know if you remember the census a while back, we had that blank page to fill out, and I decided what I would fill out was a new composition, and it's called O Gluan Gluan, which is from generation to generation, and it's very much passing the baton on to the next generation, and a direct link back to Cos. So I thought that was a nice thing to finish on. And the next thing I'm going to finish on is the very last track from the tape that Cos made me.
All the best for now, the friend Cos.
So there you go. Sinead, Mila Buejas, I hope you got a little bit of an insight into the life of Cos Teehan.